Welcome to this Black Plague painting tutorial. In this video we'll be painting Ann the Nun from the Black Plague core box set, using the official Warpaints Zombicide Black Plague paint set, as well as sprays, brushes and other Zombicide war paints from the Army Painter. Let's start by looking at the products we used in this tutorial. First, the miniature file set. We used color primer matte black, and of course Black Plague paint set, the core zombie set, and the two expansion sets, Toxic Prison set and Survivor paint set. We used the Most Wanted brush set, and we finished off with the protective Aegis suit satin varnish. The quality of the miniatures from the box set are excellent, but you still need to remove the mold lines using the files from the miniature file set. There's 3 different shapes, so finding the right file for the right job is easy. The next step is to wash all the miniatures in some hot soapy water. That way you remove any residue from the casting process, making sure that your spray and your paint sticks to the model when you start to paint. Ann is almost entirely black and metal, and we decided to go for the matte black color primer. The level of pigment in a color primer is unique, but therefore you need to use it differently from other hobby sprays. Start off by shaking the can for at least 1.5 minutes to really mix the heavy pigment inside. We stuck Ann to some cardboard while spraying, for control and also to stop the model from falling over. Now we start spraying from a distance of no more than 20 centimeters, moving the can at all times. Turn the model around and spray the back from the top and the side and the bottom, in thin coats, getting the spray all over the model. Once you're finished, make sure you turn the can upside down and empty the nozzle until only gas comes out. With the color primer spray all dry, we're ready for painting. Here we got Ann the Nun with her fellow survivor heroes sprayed using other color primers. With Ann all primed black, let's start to get some paint on the model. In this tutorial, I'll be using only the Zombicide war paints, not only from the Black Plague paint set, but also the other 3 boxes. Ann the Nun is mostly black and metal, but there's also the face, and I'll start off using the Survivor skin. I'm using the Insane Detail brush here, since it's a fairly small face. Working over a black undercoat, you might want to give 2 coats of certain colors, just to make sure you get a nice even coverage. Next bit is the metal, and that's actually half the model. In the Zombicide range we got 2 metal colors. We got Machine Gun metal, which is a darker one, and we've got the Claymore blade, which is slightly lighter. I'm going to start off using Machine Gun metal. And for this job I'm using the bigger Regiment brush. It's a big brush that helps me speed up my painting. And the trick now is really just to get metal paint all over the metal area. That's the swords and Ann's armor. With the metal area done, it's time to move on to the white hood. For that we're using the Brain Matter beige from the Zombie core set. Again, I'm using my Regiment brush to speed up the painting. And the trick is really just to get a good even coverage, as I said before. Here at the base coat stage, the trick is really not to get any paint onto the black. But if that should happen, simply touch up any mistakes using the Dead Black from the Zombie core set. And the final bits left to do at the base coat stage is Ann's belt. And for that, we're using Leather Brown, using the Insane Detail brush. And the other small bit is the gold handles on the swords, and that's been painted bright gold from the Zombicide Black Plague paint set. Now it's time to shape the model, and we'll start off using the Samba Shader from the Zombie Core paint set. It's not quite as dark and deep as the deep shader from the Black Plague paint set, and it works really well on both the skin tone and on the white. For this job, I'm always using the Regiment brush as it holds a good amount of shader. For the armor, I'm using the Survivor shader. Survivor shader is a black pigmented ink wash that goes on really well on all metallics. Regiment brush again, and then I'm just splashing on the dark ink. When you're working with the shaders, try to find the balance of giving enough paint on the model without the paint pooling or running into areas where you don't want it to be. Now it's time to highlight the model. The first stage, I'm going to use the same colors as in the base coat. So I'm starting off with the Survivor skin from the Survivor paint set. I'm using the small Insane Detail brush, and then I'm going over the face. The trick now is not to paint in the deepest recesses, like in the eye sockets and around the nose and in the mouth. And then I move on to a second highlight on the skin tone. I mix in some Brain Matter beige to my Survivor skin, about a 50-50 mix, and add a thinner highlight just on the eyebrows, on the nose and the very cheekbone. Anne's face is the natural focus point when looking at the model, so it's well worth spending a little extra time to be very careful at this stage. The next step for me is to highlight the hood. And here I'm just using Brain Matter beige, the same color as in the base stage. I'm using the Insane Detail brush again, giving it 2 thin coats just to make it as bright as possible. Following that, it's time to highlight the middle area. And for this, I'm using the Claymore blade from the Zombicide Black Plague paint set. This is a lighter color than my base coat stage where I used the Machine Gun Metal from the Survivor paint set. I'm applying a very thin highlight on the very raised edges. Notice how I use the flat side of the brush going down the side of the swords, adding a thin line as my final highlight. Next stage is to highlight the belt. It was painted leather brown, but I'm using zombie skin from the Zombie Core set as my highlight color. Using the Insane Detail brush again, I'm just adding a very thin line. And then I move on to the gold handles, adding a thin, fine highlight using bright gold. The last area of the model that needs highlighting is also the largest. That's the black robes. I'll start off with Necromancer Cloak. It's a nice dark grey that will form the foundation of my highlight. I'm using the Insane Detail brush and trying to make semi-fine lines down the edges of the robes. The trick when highlighting black is to keep your grey highlights small, otherwise you end up with an overall grey feel. The second grey highlight is done with Filthy Suit. I recommend you thin your grey paint with a little water to improve the flow, and that way you can keep your grey highlights very small and very thin. Of course, I'm using my Insane Detail brush here, and I'm trying to be as neat as possible and only to get Filthy Suit on the very edges and the very highest highlights. Like in this area, the folds on the robes is getting 3 thin stripes of Filthy Suit. And that's actually all the highlighting done. Now it's time for the detail. I'll finish off the eyes first by adding some deep shader in the very eye sockets, using the Insane Detail brush of course. I paint in the eye using Brain Matter beige. And here's a trick. When doing the other eye, hold the model upside down, and that way your brush is always working away from the nose. And finally, very carefully, dot in the pupils using Dead Black. The base of the model is painted Filthy Suit. I'm using the Regiment brush as it speeds up my painting time and it gives a good even coverage. With the Filthy Suit completely dry, I stipple on some necromancer cloak, simulating areas of dirt. For that, I use the small dry brush. After that, I take out some crusted saw and paint on areas representing old blood on the streets of Zombicide Black Plague. The trick here is to thin your paint a little bit, so sort of feather the edges a little bit. And lastly, I add a few dabs of glistening blood to sort of simulate freshly spilled blood. And that's Ann the Nun all painted up. I spent about 2 hours from start to finish, and all I have to do now is protect it with some varnish. Grab your can of Eggy Suit satin varnish and go outside. Shake the can and give your models a good thin coat from the distance of 30 centimeters. That's longer than your color primer. The varnish is really strong, so you only need a few thin coats on either side. And with that, your models is ready for gaming, and they can now survive the wear and tear of the battlefield. And that's Ann the Nun all done. Make sure you check out our other tutorial videos on the other survivors, on the zombies, on the necromancer, and of course the abomination. Enhance your gaming and play with painted miniatures. Thanks for watching.